1270 in the Shire. We're still in that golden age. They're moving towards the end of it now. Life is already not as idyllic as it was 25 years earlier, but the change isn't great. Of course, the young hobbits know nothing about what it was like before they were born. The Shire is still at peace. Gerontius, based at Great Smials, is in charge of the Shire. Maddock, based at Brandy Hall, is still in charge of Buckland. Both have held their positions for decades. In the Shire, this in itself translates as security to the Shire. They're settled into their roles. Both of them are experienced and diligent. They've got very different operational styles. Gerontius is highly adventurous for a hobbit. I'm pretty sure he would be encouraging people to re-examine the way they do their work, to bring in new techniques, to try out new tools and new breeds of animals, which in itself could unsettle some hobbits because hobbits do like things to stay the way they always have been. But given it's a golden age, given everything else is utterly secure, that's the time when a hobbit might try out something they've never thought of doing before. This is, of course, only in a small way, the sort of ways you wouldn't really see from the outside. All this time in Buckland, which I do think is far more strapped for cash than the Shire, we've got Maddock, who is very traditional, very conservative in the way he runs things. That's forcing him to run things even more conservatively than he otherwise would have. The result is the hobbits feel very, very safe. This might be the point to mention one of the innovations that I think Gerontius is encouraging in the Shire, the use of ponies. I don't think they were around very much before this. There might have been a couple. I think this is one reason that people tend to stay in their own farthing. Even a journey of 3 miles is half a day there and back because they're walking. So all of their life is contained within a very small area. I think Gerontius has introduced ponies not for everybody, but for the gentry families. For instance, to ride between Brandy Hall and Great Smiles, which cuts down the time it takes to get from one place to another, which means that more visiting can be done, or shorter visits can be done maybe. I'd say ponies are also beginning to be used more to pull ploughs and carts, to assist in harvests and the transfer of goods. Once again, I think only the gentry families own them and they use them on their properties, and the average hobbit of the lower class quite likely has never even been near one. Only the ones that are getting trained up in the use of them in the fields. Another thing I think that came in now, I think Gerontius encouraged the aristocracy of the Shire to educate all of their children. Or maybe it wasn't Gerontius, maybe it was Adamanta. In Victorian England at least, the raising of children was deemed to be women's business, which meant that women had some say in the education at least of daughters and younger sons. It was fairly standard to educate the eldest son because he was going to have to take over the household. He was going to have to know how to communicate in all the different ways with all the different peoples associated with the estate. And he was going to have to know quantities and figures, and he was going to have to be able to budget. So there was always some education given to that one, but the rest was quite often left up to the women. In 18th century and 19th century Europe, fairly often it was the women who had the social conscience. I do believe that social conscience developed in the Shire too. It was women who dealt with matters of welfare, who dealt with sickness on the estate, who dealt with injuries, who dealt with homelessness. They lacked the authority or the power to find that homeless person a new home or to find that unemployed person a new job. But the identification of the issue was very often their role. We don't know much about Adamanta, but Tolkien did put a lot of thought into the naming of his characters, and her name does imply that she's a fairly strong person, that she's not going to just sit back and ignore her own responsibilities for the Shire. I like that idea, that it was Adamanta who encouraged the education of all the children in the Shire. I have no way of knowing if that's true, but it works for me. So, just to clarify, there were no schools. Even at the time of the Fellowship of the Ring, there are no schools in the Shire. That's not how people were educated. People were educated in their own homes, either by their parents or by older siblings or by somebody who was employed specifically for that task. For example, a governess or a tutor. In the Waverley novels, young Edward Waverley was educated by his uncle's chaplain, and at the times that he was living at his father's house, by a clerk who worked with his father in London. It often led to a haphazard education. They really only learned what their parents wanted them to learn, what the person teaching them was able to teach them, and at times what they themselves were inclined to learn. But in general, the system worked. It worked well enough in England and through Europe, and it works well enough in the Shire. I also want to talk about the shape of the family tree. Family trees all have shapes. Very often, for a descendancy chart anyway, it's a triangle. Right at that top little point, you've got the first couple who starts it off. Under that, you've got all their children. Under that, you've got the grandchildren. Because on each new level, you've got a bigger generation than the previous one, you've got this shape of a triangle. We do have that here. That's what we've been seeing up to this point, and we are going to see that over this video and the next as well. And that probably seems very daunting. That's about to change. What we are actually looking at is not just a triangle, it is the upper half of a diamond. From this point on, being this video and the next, we are going to start to see less people in each generation. This is partly because half the people born now have no ongoing relevance to this study. Even if they got married and went away and had children, they're not really a part of it, so their children will not be included as I go on. Another reason is there's a couple in this generation who just did not get married and have children at all. A third reason is that some of this latest generation will marry each other, so we don't get an increase. We don't get new hobbits coming in. The fourth and final reason is that many of this generation will not have families that are as big as those of the previous generations. We're not going to see another Gerontius Took having 12 children. We will see other families that have 5 children, I think perhaps 7, but there's way fewer of them. This is probably the widest point of the tree, the largest number of individual hobbit families that we look at. After this, things might begin to tie up more tidily. Thinking about this study of 5 families, where I have written 1270 on this diagram, that's about where we're at. It's taken a long time to get to this point, but once we get over that halfway point, we'll move rather quickly towards the end. As to the structure of this video, my plan is to keep the Tooks separate from the rest, because given the number of children in the Tooks family, they're kind of half of this generation. I did plan for this video to be about them. Unfortunately, it won't be. This video and the next are going to be about the growing up of the children who were born in the last 2. I've split them into 2 groups. The families whose social life revolves around Great Smials, and the families whose social life revolves around that triangle of Budgeford, Brandy Hall and the Yale. This video is about the Great Smiles group. I did something similar in part 2. That was easy because the children were growing up together. Some of these children know each other quite well, but some don't. The parents have moved away from each other. They're getting divided into a couple of groups. They're all growing up in different ways, with different family circumstances, with different prospects before them. So that's how I'm going to take them, family by family. And I may as well get started. As I've said in the title, the Great Smiles Greater Community. So it's not just Great Smiles itself, it's the other families that live close enough to easily visit and to feel like they are more part of Great Smiles than they are of, for instance, the Yale. For the purposes of this video, this really only means the families of Mungo and Ponto. Given that they're in the West Farthing and they're the ones that have moved closer to Hobbiton first, they're very relevant. I will start with the children of Mungo. Baggins of Great Smiles. I think this is how they were seen by everyone around them now. Mungo Baggins has fully established himself in the professional ranks of the Shire. I still think he's a lawyer. I don't see him as a partner in the Grubb lawyer firm. I see him as a senior employee who is given important work to do within the company. I definitely see him firmly established as Gerontius's best friend now. I think the two of them spend their evenings together, have many talks, discuss the needs of Great Smiles together, and brainstorm over ways to deal with problems that arise. This video is not about Mungo. It's about his children. But this is how his children see him. This is their world. 5 children: Bungo the eldest, Belba, Longo, Linda, and Bingo. They see that their father is an important person. They see that he is responsible and respectable. And I think this is where the respectability of the Bagginses come in. Life in Great Smiles is very different to life in the general run of the Shire. To all effects, this is an urban community. These children of Mungo Baggins are effectively growing up in a city. They've got people all around them. It's a massive underground burrows. It's a giant place, and it's also continually expanding. Unlike the Brandybucks, the Tooks are loaded with money, which means they can be very generous. They can hold massive banquets and have everybody in the whole region come and eat for free. As we know from the Fellowship of the Ring, there was a tradition to give presents when it's your birthday rather than receive them. I would imagine Gerontius Took's birthday was a massively expensive occasion when he gave gifts to pretty much everybody in the whole Shire. He could do that because the Tooks had the wealth. They were rich, and the Baggins children are growing up alongside all that wealth. They're not noticing it as somebody else's wealth. They are so completely included in the family of Gerontius Took that when they were young at least, this would have seemed like their own wealth. Anything they wanted was there for them to have. We don't get many descriptions of life inside Great Smiles. Tolkien tells us a little bit about what it's like to live in Brandy Hall, and we can extrapolate some details from that. But Great Smiles comes through in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit as a kind of mysterious, otherworldly place. Great Smiles is effectively the palace of the Shire. So for the Bagginses to grow up here, I'm assuming that each family had a couple of rooms of their own that were assigned to them inside Great Smiles. Gerontius Took would have had quite a few rooms assigned to him. It would have been a mansion buried inside the greater mansion of Great Smiles. But everybody else, all the minor parties, probably had 2, 3, maybe 4 rooms that were entirely their own that they could shut everybody else out of. And then there would have been a bunch of public spaces. Chances are they could eat inside their own burrows, but also had the opportunity of eating in a giant dining hall. I would say there was no cooking inside their own little rooms because we are underground. They could probably go and fetch food and bring it back there. And they probably washed clothes outside, or there was staff whose job it was to wash all the clothes and they just took it to a communal laundry. It could have been something like that. But for our Baggins children who are not doing the housework, it would have been a matter of they sleep in their own couple of rooms. They probably eat there, and the rest of the time I would say they're spending with the Took children. They're doing lessons with the Took children. Gerontius was an intelligent man and he had such an active brain. I think any time he could not learn something new would have been positively painful for him. And he would make sure in turn that his children never experienced that. They would be in a world rich with knowledge, a world rich with opportunity to learn new things, to read, to explore. I'm going to talk about this much more in my video on the Tooks, but I need to mention it here because the Baggins children are experiencing this too. That said, the Baggins children are not Tooks. Even though these 5 Baggins children are in a very privileged position and living the life of important people now, they don't have much family history and their position among the important ranks is still rather tenuous. They have first cousins who are living a very different lifestyle. While I think Mungo and Laura would not in any way want to inhibit their children, they would certainly be aware that if their children are to continue living in the way they've grown up, which becomes eventually the only way they know how to live, then their upbringing has to be conducted very carefully so that the children maintain some kind of relevant expectation for their future and know what effort they have to put in if they want to maintain this lifestyle. Kind of what Largo needed and didn't get. Assuming their father Mungo is a lawyer and assuming their grandfather Mr. Grubb is also a lawyer and maybe uncles are lawyers, the law is a very logical field for them to be trained up in. Hobbits don't like change, and that's probably the case for lawyers more than any other kind, because while it looks like a glamorous career, the law involves a huge amount of pedantry and a huge amount of just getting stuck into the boring details. Therefore, I'm thinking these 5 children were probably raised so that the boys would go into the law and the girls would marry well. Mungo and Laura would also have been aware that it's highly unlikely their daughters will find husbands among the Tooks. While they're playing perfectly happily together, that class system is still in place, and they can't expect to make brilliant marriages like that just because they're compatible playmates as children. Anyone watching this who knows even a little bit about the family trees of the Hobbits might think that I've forgotten something at this point. I haven't. I'm just looking at the Baggins' situation in the world and what Mungo and Laura could possibly have imagined was coming in the future. They've got 5 children to launch on the world. Those 5 children are living a very easy life at the moment, and they've only got that because of Mungo's hard work and the fact that he was willing to take himself right away from his own family circle to achieve it. They're being very wise parents at this point. They know their children. They know the personalities and the strengths and weaknesses of their children. They're doing a great job. And in doing that, they are raising the profile of the Bagginses in the Shire. So while the 5 Baggins children are spending a lot of time with the Tooks, gaining a whole lot of polish, gaining an appreciation of art and good foods, all the things that the Took children can take for granted, Mungo and Laura are making sure that their children don't lose sight of their origins. So they're visiting their cousins, the Boffins, Otto's children, out at the Boffin estate. They're visiting Ponto's farm, and it's being impressed on them that Rosa and Polo, who don't have very many privileges at all, are going to be there for them in 80 years' time in a way the Tooks may not. They're visiting their cousin Fosco in a little shop in Whitfarrow. And this is a confusing way to grow up, especially since the world is changing a bit. The landed gentry is getting a bit more educated. They are travelling more. But of course, even now, the Bagginses are not landed gentry. They're nearly gentry. They've got 95% of what it takes, and their standing in the community is good enough that everybody will accept them as such. But they still don't have land. You do need land to be landed gentry. This generation of Bagginses, I think, began to have associations with Hobbiton. One way this might have happened is because of Mungo's sister Lily, who married Togo Goodbody, and I think settled somewhere on the west side of the East Farthing, north of the water. Which means that if you were coming from Great Smials wanting to visit Lily, the logical way to get there would be to go through Hobbiton, and I think this might be one reason they became aware of the region and started spending time there. Now, my map is a little shaky here. I'd advise anyone who wants to see how it was really set out to go look at the map in the prefaces to the Fellowship of the Ring. I have the bends of the water slightly wrong. This was just an approximation to show where things were. In Tolkien's map, the road to Hobbiton comes up from the East Road, which you can see here. It crosses the water at a bridge at Bywater, and it carries on up to the North Farthing. Hobbiton is slightly to the west of that, very close, an easy walking distance, maybe a couple of miles. So I've put my little road triangle here because the road forks at that point. You can either carry on and go up to the North Farthing, or you can veer left and go to Hobbiton. But as Hobbiton became a more major town, that would have become the more major stopping point on the journey from Tookbank or Tutborough up to the North Farthing. And that's why I've put that little wiggly triangle there that looks like I just went a bit wrong in my drawing. The road heading directly east that I've drawn in, going across to where I think Lily Goodbody was living, I've just made that up. The roads are very sparse in that region in Tolkien's map, but I think that's only because he had no need to draw them in. He had no story in that region. He had no hobbits going to and from that area. So I do think it's logical that a road was running on that north side of the water heading east as well. And if it was, that would be a simple way to get to the Goodbodies, because you need to cross the water. You need a bridge. You can go down to Frogmorton, which is on the way to Whitfarrow on the East Road, but that's still a bit of a trek. I think this would have been the simpler way to get there. And if it was, then it's a logical reason for our hobbits, the Bagginses, to gain a familiarity with Hobbiton, and for the Hobbiton hobbits to become familiar with the Bagginses. It's on their way. It's a nice place. They probably stopped for lunch there. They met people there. They came to like the region very much. I think in these early days they weren't living there, but they were now beginning to be seen around the place and maybe meet others from there. To finish this section on Mungo's children, I'm going to look at each one of them individually, their personalities and their life experience as a child. First of all, Bungo. Bungo Baggins was the eldest son of Mungo and Laura. I've talked before about eldest sons. It was a position in the family that came with greater responsibilities than any other child held. I'm pretty sure Bungo would have taken these responsibilities very seriously. Bungo is mentioned in The Hobbit. He's described as solid and comfortable. There's a little bit about his history there, which I won't go into now because that's going to happen later in his life. Despite those few details, it's very hard to get a feel for who Bungo was. So, of course, I've extrapolated based on the few details we have and how he ends up down the track. My thought is that he was a very intelligent, very studious, very scholarly child. As the eldest son of Mungo Baggins, Gerontius probably took a particular interest in him and influenced the way he learned and the way he saw the world. In effect, gave him an inquiring turn of mind. Bungo must have been an intelligent hobbit, perfectly capable of imbibing all the new notions that Gerontius threw at him. At the same time, he was a child of his parents, raised, I think, to be responsible and respectable and consistent. I think Bungo probably grew up with this dichotomy of expectations. On the one hand, Gerontius was trying to pull out all the imagination and ingenuity that Bungo had. On the other, his parents were reminding him to be sensible and solid. The result is, I think, that Bungo was a very obedient child, very compliant, and in order to meet both these expectations, he sat there quietly with his books, doing his studies, doing all the things his parents wanted him to, but he took particularly deep dives into that material. And in that way, he did what Gerontius wanted. I think he took the fields of mathematics and philosophy and astronomy and all those things that little bit further than most hobbits did, and became something of an expert on them. While on the surface, he was your regular, staid, potentially boring hobbit. When we get to the Took video, I'll talk about the adventures they have, and I do think Bungo accompanied the Took boys when they went exploring the Shire. He wasn't entirely an indoors hobbit, but that's what his parents wanted of him. As he became a young adult, I think Bungo himself may have realised that the lawyer life wasn't going to suit him. Being the eldest son of Mungo and the grandson of Mr. Grubb, if I'm right about that, I'd say the pressure on him was immense to follow his father into a law career, but I don't see that as being Bungo's bent. Partly because I don't believe that's what he did later. What we know of him later on does not suggest he had any kind of career like that. I think that must have showed itself now. He wasn't really suited to that. He did become highly educated. He is, in effect, like a university-trained hobbit, without having been university-trained. But an education from Gerontius is effectively the same thing. I won't say any more about his future prospects at this point. I think that was where he found himself as he grew up. He grew up playing with the older Took boys. He's positioned in between Hildefonse and Isambard. It only leaves a few hobbits at his own age when he wants companions. His Boffin cousins, who were his first cousins on his mother's side and his second cousins on his father's, are 10 years younger than him, probably too young to actually be companions. So that's how I see his life. He's associating with those older Tooks. He's studying hard. Gerontius is taking a special interest in him. He's expected to follow a law career, and I think he is applying himself to that quite diligently, but it is not exciting him at all. He's just doing it because he has to. And in his spare time, he's thinking philosophically about the world and gazing at the stars and wondering just what they are, and going for long walks and thinking about how society is structured and all of those sorts of things. Belba. We have absolutely no information from Tolkien about Belba's personality. I see her as an adventurous girl, a girl with a sense of humour, a girl who is quick and witty, also very intelligent, and given Tolkien's world where boys and girls were raised differently, I think Belba was a girl who could hold her own with the boys and have a good conversation with them. So here's Belba growing up. Her older brother is 10 years older than her. That's close enough that they might have done some things together, but distant enough that she was just physically not as able to do the things that Bungo could do. And by the time she's, say, 10 years old, he's approaching his tweens and doing completely different things altogether. I am pretty sure that Belba was very close to the three remarkable daughters of Gerontius Took, particularly the second of the three, who was the closest to her in age. I think the girls banded together. There are only 3 Took girls. There are 2 girls in the Baggins family, and we also have Ponto's daughter Rosa, who I think is included in this group. The 6 girls, I think, were a tight unit. I guess I see Belba as being a very active girl. I imagine she was quick to learn to read and write. I imagine she was an energetic child who spent a lot of time out of doors. I think she would have been very much up for pony riding and climbing trees. I imagine her as light on her feet, agile, with a great sense of balance. I don't know why, that's just how I see her. I think this changed as she got older, though. I think once she reached the end of childhood, what her parents saw as childhood, which I would imagine to be somewhere around the age of 20, when she enters her teens, I think she would have been pulled back from the group. After which, she would probably have spent more time at home with her parents and doing organised social activities. Things deemed more suitable for a young lady. And that's all I have to say about Belba as a child growing up. Longo. Tolkien hasn't given us many clues about Longo either, so I have deduced what I can from his position in the tree and from events surrounding his descendants later on. I think Longo did become a lawyer, at least for a while. I also think Longo spent his whole life trying to measure up to the very, very high standard set by Bungo, who probably didn't know anything about that. To Longo, it would have looked like Bungo had everything. Bungo would have seemed like his parents' great hope. Bungo was the one that Gerontius was spending all the time on. Bungo was the one that people complimented all the time in polite society. There's this awful thing that can happen to younger children where when you enter a world that an older sibling has already been a part of, people will always come up to you and say, so you're such and such's younger brother, sister. We can expect things of you then. And that's an awful place to put a child. Whether the elder sibling's reputation was good or bad, younger children can at times feel that their first job has to be asserting themselves as an individual. I think Longo experienced a great deal of this. I further think Longo would have been happier with a quieter upbringing than he actually had. If he'd grown up on a little farm in the country, like at the Boffin's place, he would probably have been perfectly happy. He didn't need the ostentation of great Smials. Not that it was ostentatious by our standards, by human standards, but by Hobbit standards it was. He's a very quiet boy. He doesn't really like pomp and ceremony, but he's diligent and competent, and he does see the law as a more exciting career than his older brother does. His intention is to practice the law in the future. I don't know that he does this. He might. I think at this time, Longo was a child who got lost among all the exuberance and noise and bluster of the Tooks. He was a quiet child. He liked quiet things. He preferred to sit in a library than be out in the hills riding ponies. He was not a child who liked to wrestle. I think he did like people, but he needed those people in measured doses, not a great crowd of them at once. And so that's how I see him growing up, sort of sitting on the sidelines. Longo and Bingo are close in age. They were probably each other's best friends as well. Because going forward, there doesn't seem to be much association with the Tooks among their descendants. So my further thought is that both of these younger sons of Mungo, when they grew up, took on some kind of clerical career, maybe as a lawyer. I could see Longo running a post office. We know they had post offices in the Shire, and that was a responsible job that required a reasonably high level of literacy. I think that's what he did. I think Longo trained as a lawyer, worked a little bit as a lawyer in Great Smiles, but he wasn't actually needed there. And remember, law in these days, to be a lawyer, there's no courts. This is not a matter of defence and trial or anything like that. To be a lawyer in these days is a paperwork job. This is writing up wills, marriage settlement documents, documents of sales, disposing of deceased estates, all of those sorts of not terribly exciting duties. It's a matter of writing up contracts and keeping records. It was useful to have people doing that job in the Shire, especially where so many people could not read or write at all. So I think Longo trained to do this, and as an adult, that's what he set up as. Now, I know I haven't talked about the others as an adult, and the only reason I'm talking about Longo now is because I think that this was shaping in him as a child. As this quiet child who preferred to sit in the corners than be in the centre of the action. I think this explains how he lived as an adult as well. The big thing is, I think Longo was actually the first Baggins to move to Hobbiton. I think he went out there maybe to set up an office to be a lawyer, but honestly, my guess is he went out there and worked in the post office. The fact that this isn't mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, I think fits with society in general. Tolkien does seem to have had a lively enthusiasm for the vagaries of the human mind in society, and the way he presents all of the characters of the past in gossip, which he does in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. We learn about characters from the past because two people are sitting in a pub talking about them. That sort of thing. When social memory is just passed on in stories, people forget the timelines. I have undertaken a great deal of family history, and I've spent some time on local history too. In the course of this, I've taken a lot of oral histories. The difference in people's memory and what actually happened is sometimes very stark. It's still telling, it's still valuable because you find out what mattered to them. You find out what impacted that person by what they remember and what they don't remember. The implication through the trees that the Bagginses are a Hobbiton family and have been there for some time, I don't think they need to have been there very long for that to be considered established fact. My concluding thought about this, the reason I mentioned this at all, is that once the Baggins are established in society as a gentry family, all mention of them holding lesser positions, if they ever did, are going to be discreetly omitted from the tree and from people's memories. If the family is in favour, people will completely forget that Largo ever ran a shop or that Longo ever ran a post office. Now, both of those positions, given the society that they're in at the time that they did it, are not as lowly as we see them today. And I don't want that to sound like I'm thinking they're socially inferior jobs, because they're absolutely not. But we've got a very different view under modern society of who can do these tasks and the level of responsibility attached to them. Postal managers tend not to be paid highly in the modern world. We therefore don't view them with the same deference as we view, for instance, bank managers, university professors, or doctors. In these days in the Shire, where people did not read and write, it was an important thing to be a postal manager, just as it was in our society in the 1800s an important role to hold. It was a respectable role, and postal managers were deemed to be respectable people. So Longo holding this role would further the reputation of the Bagginses around Hobbiton as being respectable hobbits. So that's how I see Longo, a quiet child sitting in the background, reading books, feeling a little bit inferior to his more illustrious older brother, wanting very much to make his parents happy. He grows up studying the law. Linda. I don't need to say much about Linda. She's not very relevant going forward. She does have descendants who make an appearance in the first chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring, so it's worth saying something about her. But I don't need to go into much detail. She's the second youngest child of Mungo and Laura. She grew up with all the rest in Great Smials. She's the youngest of the 6 girls that I think were a tight unit, the eldest of whom is Belba. There is nothing to be gleaned about Linda's personality from anything that we learn anywhere else. There's a fair chance that growing up she was close to her first cousin Primrose Boffin, who is only 3 years younger than she is, and I do think there was a fair bit of comings and goings between those two households, being the children of Laura and Lavender, who were sisters. Primrose probably came to stay at Great Smiles, and Linda very likely went to stay in the Boffin house. Linda is also the same age as one of the Brandybuck daughters, but I can see no indication that she had anything to do with the Brandybucks. I think by this time this branch of the Bagginses are firmly attached to Great Smiles and didn't really see the Brandy Hall people very much at all. Since that's all we know about Linda, I'll move on to the youngest in the family. Bingo. Bingo became a law clerk, I'm pretty sure. He followed in his father's footsteps. He may have actually become a lawyer. It's very hard to know. I'd say that Bingo ended up in Great Smiles, but he might have spent a few years away before he settled down. I sort of feel I need to place him around Hobbiton, but I can't see what he did there. Maybe the grub firm of lawyers actually set up an office in Hobbiton and Bingo went and worked there. But looking at his descendants, I'd say his connections were more closely tied to Great Smiles. I do see him as being very close to his brother Longo. And that's really all I can say about him. That's it for Mungo's family. I've gone into some detail about them because they're an important part in the transition from the Shire of long ago to the Shire that we all recognise in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The Bagginses are becoming more respectable and they've found Hobbiton. Moving on to Ponto's family. Ponto is an interesting one in this study. In my scenario at least, he's living in a small property of his own. Now when I say his own, maybe he owns it outright, but I know in at least the British Isles between the 1500s and the 1800s, you could lease a property for the entirety of your life. In fact, you could lease a property for 300 or 400 years so that the lease remained in your family, and effectively you pass that property down as if it was your own by nominating who would take over the lease when you passed away. This happened quite a bit, for example, in Ireland. Tolkien doesn't go into any details about land ownership in the Shire, and effectively the whole Shire has been leased from the king. So from that perspective, you could say that no hobbit could own land in it anyway. Putting all that aside, whether it's lease or outright ownership, in my scenario, Ponto has, I think, this little property, and it's very small. I said before that the Bagginses don't own land. If Ponto has this property, this very small property, it might seem that the Bagginses do have land, but land with a capital L, was something quite different to this. Proper land that made you landed gentry was an estate on which probably there was accommodation for several families. What Ponto has is a single house with probably a few paddocks around it. We're talking something very humble. So, having knocked down the importance of this property to this degree, it was still property. Ponto is a younger son. The property isn't important to the Baggins family at large, but when you've got a little property like this and you can pass it down, then you can effectively start off your own important side branch of the family. If Ponto keeps his property all his life, improves it a little, does what he can, and then passes it on to his son Polo, Polo might be able to add another bedroom, put up new fences, maybe buy another paddock next door. And then if he has a son who he passes it on to, that son can do the same. In that way, the property could, over a century or two, grow into something very grand. This is how I think the Boffin property evolved. The Boffin property is quite grand now, but it probably started exactly this way. A little humble cottage with a couple of paddocks that the Boffins over the years have added onto and increased and built the house up, until in the modern day, the Boffin property is beginning to be something of a full estate on its own. Maybe what we're seeing with Ponto's little farm is the seeds of a future large estate, somewhere way beyond the end of Return of the King. Since properties did evolve in this way, in general, he'll likely gain a bit of respect, at least within his family, for having this. Maybe this is a future important place if it's handled right by its owners. So that gives a little bit more standing to his children, because even if it's just a tiny little farm and they're doing it tough and they're working really long hours because they can't afford to employ other people to come in and help, Polo is probably working as many hours on this place as his father. It still remains the case that Polo will inherit it. If they've got a little farm like this, Polo has joined the ranks of the hobbits around them who are going to step into their own place later on. The hard work about his future has been done already, in a way that Bungo Baggins's has not, which was why property remaining in the same family brought security in a system like this. The property is the real legacy. In a place where there isn't money, that kind of living security means a lot, even if land itself is not considered an asset in the way it is to us today. So having framed the family in this way, we've got two children. We have Rosa and Polo. I see them as being about 5 years apart. Rosa is the elder child. I talked about this at length before. I don't think they've got much money. I do think that Gerontius Took has taken an interest in the family and wishes the best for them and encourages the children to spend as much time as they can at Great Smiles. I'd say he was keen on both of them being educated along with his own children and Mungo's children. But being a little farm that requires a great deal of labour, I'd say Polo didn't have much time to go. So I think Rosa spent a great deal more time at Great Smiles than Polo did. Rosa probably stayed with Mungo's family for lengthy periods of time. The futures of Rosa and Polo are a large part of my reasoning in deciding that Gerontius was a friend of Balbo Baggins and not only of Mungo, because if he was only associated with Mungo, there'd be no reason for Ponto's family to be involved with the Tooks in the way that they are. Rosa was born the same year as the second Took girl, also the same year as Belba. I'd say those three were particularly close. I've basically covered Rosa and Polo already, but just to conclude, I'll take each separately. Rosa. She's 5 years older than her brother. She is exactly the same age as her cousin Belba Baggins and the second Took daughter. I would say she spent a great deal of time at Great Smiles and imbued much sophistication and polish. I would further say that she's a very beautiful girl, and probably very sweet and friendly, only because of her future. I don't know this, I can't know this. Because of the way Tolkien describes women in his stories. I'll talk about her more in later videos. Polo. Once again, not much to say about him. I did say before he's not really relevant going forward. I'm going to keep him in here because he does have descendants who are named. I don't think he had the opportunity to spend much time at Great Smiles, not as much as Rosa, because he is the son of the family. He did have work to do, he did have farm work to do, and he was likely to inherit this property if there is indeed a property to inherit, which, remember, is only my theory. That is not out of Tolkien's work. But I have to individualise them in some way, and this does fit with all the events. This is just my attempt to individualise him and give them all slightly different stories so we can wrap our heads around who are who. So in my theory, he's going to inherit this little property. He didn't need to have the education of Mungo's children. He wasn't going to go into what we would call a white-collar job. He's a dignified hobbit with good connections. He's at about the level of a squire. And that's actually all I need to say. So, moving on to the final family I'm going to talk about in this video, the 4 children of Otto Boffin. They're way over in the Yale, and you would think that they belong in my video about the East Farthing Hobbits that's coming up. But I don't think they do. Looking at their descendants, looking at what they did, who they were, how they lived from this point on, I would say their ties with the families around them, including the Bulgars and the Brandybucks, I'm sure they were still part of the social circle, but they're not close friends. These 4 children do not develop close friendships with those families, so we begin to see a bit of a pullback by the Boffins from those around them here, from those geographically near them. They're increasing in prominence, definitely. The Boffins are rising up into the level of a proper estate now. Otto is doing very well. I'd say they're not rich because nobody's rich except the Tooks, but they're doing well enough. Whatever they produce in their place, they're producing very well. Lavender is educating those 4 children very carefully. She has, I believe, come out of Great Smiles. As a child, she grew up in that urban environment that has just a different sort of sophistication to the country hobbits anyway. She's come out here and married Otto, but I'd say she doesn't want her children to lack that urban polish that she has. So I think she sent them very, very often to go and stay with her sister Laura's family, Laura being the wife of Mungo. I'm putting a lot of extra people into Mungo's household here. And I said earlier, I only think they have a few rooms. I'd say Gerontius helped out here. I'd say there are other quarters nearby. Gerontius is very glad to have them come over. He'll take whoever wants to come. Gerontius was a hobbit with a big heart, and he loved to help everybody who he could help. He would have welcomed the 4 Boffins when they came over to stay, and they would have had lessons with all the others. And I think that was actually the group that they had over there growing up. We've got 11 Took children. Now, they're not all going to be young at the same time because they spread out over nearly 30 years. 11 Took children, 5 children of Mungo Baggins, 2 children of Ponto Baggins, although I don't think Polo was there all the time, and the 4 children of Otto and Lavender. It's a massive group. But I think all of them spent a significant amount of time at Great Smiles, getting educated by the best minds in the Shire, doing all the networking you can do in an urban centre, and gaining all sorts of new ideas for how they're going to go forward and live in the world as adults. These Boffin children are growing up in the same house on the same property as I believe Balbo Baggin's children did in the last generation, but I don't think they're living anywhere near the same lifestyle. I don't think these hobbits are allowed to go and bathe in the river, for instance. They're not going boating. They're not mixing with so many of the families around them. So to talk about them individually, the eldest of these 4 is Hugo. This is a good time to revisit the eldest son's idea that I had, which is a concept that was strong in the Shire. We start off with Buffo, born sometime after 1110. Buffo's eldest son was Bosco. Bosco's eldest son was Otto, and Otto is still in charge of the Boffin household. Otto has married Lavender Grubb, and their eldest son is Hugo. I've brought this up here to show that Hugo has quite a tradition to uphold. He's not alone in this. This was what happened with eldest sons. They did have this tradition. They did have the weight of all of their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and whatever illustrious things they did for their families. Every eldest son was kind of expected, without it really being said, to not only continue the valued traditions of their predecessors, but also to add some new twist that improved things. It's a particularly complicated thing to do when your family is on the ascendancy like the Boffin household is, because you can't just do it as you saw your father do it. Things are different. It's growing. It's changing. Your place in society is different. There'll be more people coming and asking you for advice and for help, and you're dealing with greater and greater families. Otto handled this beautifully, and his will be a hard act to follow. But if anyone can do it, it's Hugo. Hugo is one of these eldest sons for whom his life is basically assured. He's got a property to come into. He's got a job he's going to be doing for the rest of his life. It would be very tough if he doesn't want it, but this is Tolkien's Shire, so Hugo is perfectly happy with his life prospects. It's going to be a bit more of a challenging role for him than it was for Otto because of the increasing grandeur of the Boffin property. But Hugo's getting the right education to handle that. He's mixing with the others in the community. Gerontius is going to teach him some very important tricks of the trade, and he's got Otto to give him advice. Otto is doing a fabulous job. Now, I've mentioned before that people had nicknames in the Shire, and this extended to some common people that people tended to remember into the future. Otto was known as Otto the Fat, which I'd like to talk about because that's a very loaded word in the modern world. Fat, in this context, really meant satisfied. A fat hobbit was happy. A fat hobbit was jolly and content. That was a connotation that Tolkien usually put on that word. Chances are they were physically large as well, but that was the same thing. Somebody who was physically large, in effect, was cited. Not only a large girth, but a large personality, a large amount of happiness. A fat hobbit was healthier. They were the peacekeeper in the group. They were the one you wanted to have around because they were the nicest people there. Tolkien's not the only one from his generation that used that term. That was a common connotation for the word fat through the 18th, 19th century. And that's how Tolkien means it when he uses it here. So Otto the Fat is a large, genial, happy, content hobbit. And that makes him a great father for Hugo. So Hugo's doing all right. I don't have much to say about his personality. I don't know what his personality was. I don't see the Boffins as being quite as innovative as the Bagginses or as courageous, but they were certainly adventurous enough. As we know, they've got family in Bree, and one of their members went to sea. I think by this time, though, they're sitting back rather quietly, and Lavender is encouraging them to be a bit more conventional. I see Hugo as having some of the personality of his father. He's a happy hobbit. He's probably got a good sense of humour. He is amiable and willing to go along with anything, and he's not going to pick fights. He's going to see the best in everybody. He's certainly going to have an opinion about things, and he's got a few management skills behind him. But at this point, I think he's just your typical outgoing hobbit boy. I really don't have much to say about Utho. He's the second son. He might have visited Great Smials at times, but looking at the tree and his descendants, I think he's ended up somewhere in the East Farthing near the Yale. So I'm guessing he's spending most of his time out here now. He's not a major part of this going forward. I will keep him in here because we know something about his descendants. He's just another hobbit boy growing up in the Yale. And honestly, ditto for Rollo. Got some descendants for them. All we need to know now is that they're a couple of younger brother hobbits in the Boffin household. Maybe they stay on the property with their future wives. They're there. That's it. That's all I need to say. Primrose. I need to say something about Primrose. She's the youngest in the family. which is an indication that Otto's doing well because he had 3 boys and then a girl. She was born in 1265, which makes her significantly younger than her Baggins cousins. I don't think she spent much time out of Great Smiles with the others. She's too young. She's out of line of the generations. She might have gone there a little bit for visits with her Aunt Laura, but I don't think she was in the big gaggle of Hobbit children who were growing up and playing and getting educated out there all at the same time. As I said before, I think she probably was quite close to Linda Baggins. But beyond that, I'm not seeing any connections between her and the others, as she is relevant going forward, and she will definitely end up in this region. I do think she spent some time at Great Smiles because that's a logical place for her to have met the person she eventually marries. But beyond that, I don't really know. I would say she's got more boffin in her than grub. I think she's probably something of a country girl at heart. Somebody who would have gotten on really well with the 7 hobbits that I talked about in part 2 of this series. She's something from a previous generation. She's not an intellectual. She's just a sweet girl enjoying life as it comes to her. And that's really all I have to put into this video. I think those 3 families, the Mungo Baggins, the Ponto Baggins and the Otto Boffins, were all part of the Great Smiles scene, and I think the other Hobbit families were more part of the East Farthing Brandy Hall scene. It's not that these 3 families didn't see the others, but they didn't see them very much. They saw them in the way you do see distant cousins and the children of your parents' friends. It's not part of their daily world. I'm leaving this video here because it's getting long. We haven't really covered any time in this one because I just wanted to introduce the characters. I've done that now. The next video is the same. I'll be talking about all the hobbits in the Brandy Hall social circle. And the video after that, I'm going to go on to talk about the Tooks. And in that video, I'll be tying all these hobbits together. As I said, it's the widest part of the diamond. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different individuals. And I'm hoping that I can move it forward in such a way that it makes a lot of sense. Thank you for watching.